Hey everyone, I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about a couple concepts that I think are important to our module for this week. And that's essentially looking at test bias versus test fairness, or test fairness versus test bias. And I've got it on the slide there. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what the difference is between fairness and bias. The primary difference is that fairness is actually a social concept. What you think is fair might be different from what I think is fair. Bias, on the other hand, does have a single meaning or multiple meanings, but definitive meanings based on statistical, scientific, psychometric properties. Two specific types of test bias or measurement bias are content bias and construct bias. Now, it's probably important to mention that these are not the only two types of test bias, but they're probably the most frequently discussed types, and they provide some ideas that we can talk about. So content bias, the term content bias, refers to items that are going to be more familiar or more appropriate for one group than another group. It could be a cultural group, a gender group, an age group. And then construct bias refers to the degree to which a test does not actually measure the stated process, ability, and disorder. Now, many of you will remember that when we have discussed these terms previously in the semester, you probably also will notice, just looking at the definitions, that these terms aren't going to necessarily be mutually exclusive. A test can have content bias that leads it to also have construct bias. So one example that I like to draw on is from the Miller Analogies test. And I like to talk about the MAT because I know a lot of you guys, and actually myself, I took it when I was applying for graduate school way back when. So it's used as an academic achievement test, much like the GRE. And the idea behind the MAT is that through presenting evaluees with analogies that have holes or blanks in them, we can get a sense of that person's reasoning ability and a sense of that person's mastery of certain content. So the way that the items are supposed to be read is like this. Blank, selecting from this area right here, blank is to Broadway as castle is to Rhine. Again, blank is to Broadway as castle is to Rhine. So you've got the set of the second two items that are presented, Broadway and Rhine, and then from the first two items, you're missing the first item. So you're supposed to pick the item that fits with to fill out that first set. And in this case, the correct answer is D. Theater is to Broadway as castle is to Rhine. And we'll look at the reasoning for that. Well, Broadway in New York City, in Manhattan, is well known for the theaters that are lined up and down the street. So if you're walking down Broadway, you look on both sides and you see all the bright lights of the theaters. And similarly, or somewhat similarly, the Rhine River is in Europe is known for the castles that line the river. So if you're floating down a canoe in the river and you look to your right and you look to your left, you'd see a whole bunch of castles like you might see theaters. Now, why might this be a problematic question if we're trying to measure academic achievement? Well, clearly, there are going to be aspects of knowledge and experience that are not necessarily reflective of intelligence or cognitive abilities. Individuals from certain class backgrounds are going to be more familiar with the layout of Broadway, for example, than individuals from other class backgrounds. If we're trying to assess academic achievement and cognitive ability, how important is it that individuals have knowledge of these specific cultural institutions, such as Broadway? So looking at construct bias, now again here, I want to reiterate that content bias and construct bias can indeed overlap. Construct bias specifically refers to the degree to which a test does not measure the stated process, ability, or disorder. So this would be an example where items have different meanings for different people based on, for example, racial ethnic identity, gender orientation, age, or some other factor that's irrelevant to what it is you're trying to assess. Now, I didn't include a specific item example for construct bias, but one thing I thought that would be effective to discuss is construct bias as it can occur in personality assessment. According to the DSM, a personality disorder is an enduring pattern of psychological experience and behavior that differs prominently from cultural expectations as shown in two or more areas of functioning, including cognition, affect, or interpersonal functioning, and or impulse control. Now, how can looking at the idea of, or the concept of personality disorder maybe tune us into some of the pitfalls of construct bias? Well, I think about my own clinical experience, and I might I might have been working with someone at the VA. Let's say this individual was a first generation immigrant who maybe emigrated from his or her country of origin in mid-adolescence, for example. And this individual is presenting with some personality characteristics that to me seem kind of problematic and that I think are messing up their ability to succeed in their rehabilitation program. So I decide to administer or have the appropriate assessment professional administer a personality assessment. In that assessment is going to be normed on a group actually primarily of white European American. Now, our hypothetical individual may have come from the culture that the hypothetical individual came from, emigrated from, may actually involve a bunch of behaviors or a range of behavior that differs prominently from our cultural expectations. So in the process of assessing this individual personality, if it is a test that has cultural bias inherent in it, the test is likely to focus on items that aren't going to be indicative of pathology in individuals from different cultures. For example, there are some South and Central American cultures that may view injury or illness having something to do with the spirit world. Well, for the most part, in our culture, folks are going to see that as outside of the norm and pathological. So we might say that would be a psychological experience related to cognition. Well, if an individual came from one of these South American cultures that do believe that the spirit world is involved in our physical health, then the fact that that individual believes that, holds that belief, is not going to be indicative of any sort of personality disorder. Does that make sense? So if in our assessment, that's one of the things that we look at, if there are questions about relationships between the spiritual world and the physical world, and the individual answers that he does believe that such a connection exists, well, that could potentially trigger a false positive. Because, of course, you can't conclude that every individual from a given population or culture has a personality disorder. So if you hold the beliefs of your culture, so again, what we're talking about when we talk about measurement bias are sources of irrelevant variance. So differences in scores between say a normal score and an abnormal score, differences in scores that do not point to any condition or indication of the construct that you're actually investigating. This often results in systematically higher or lower scores for members of particular groups. We could kind of take this idea and think about it in terms of the hypothetical client from South America. Now, of course, testing and test fairness is it's an ethical issue, and it's kind and then again, as I mentioned a moment ago, most psychological measurements in use in the US currently were developed and standardized primarily on a white European American population. So there are going to be times, and we've discussed this throughout the semester, where certain specific instruments are not going. And why is this important? Well, we talked about fairness. Fairness is important. Again, I might think one thing is fair. You might think is another thing is fair. It's also important from a clinical perspective because lack of evidence that a test provides accurate information for individuals outside of the culturally dominant group. Lack of evidence in support of accuracy can lead to interpretations of test results that are also inaccurate. And this can lead to misdiagnosis. It can lead to poor assessment of, say, intelligence or ability, which then in turn can inform poor clinical decisions. So then we kind of move outside of the realm of test fairness and or move outside of the realm of test fairness and into the realm of clinical efficacy. So a lot of the time, I like to think about test bias in those terms because it's a lot more it's a much more solid way to think about test bias, to think about it in terms of how is this going to help me do my job or not help me do my job? How is this test going to provide information that's going to help the person it's supposed to help, or how is it not going to do that? That's oftentimes not going to be debatable. It's not going to be a question of whether or not I think it's fair that members of a specific group score lower on a given test than members of a different specific group. Well, that might be fair, that might not be fair. And so, how do we approach this in rehabilitation counseling? Well, according to our code of ethics, and I think according to just good common sense, we exercise good informed consent. We want our consumers to know why tests are being administered, what the results are going to be used for, the way that results may influence different aspects of their programs, so that folks can decide if they want to participate in testing when that's an option. We want to recognize that culture definitely it affects how disorders are defined. We want to be aware of the degree to which socioeconomic and cultural experiences contribute to diagnosis and misdiagnosis, I guess, actually more specifically. And we want to avoid, whenever possible, using instruments that lack appropriate psychometric properties. Now, we did talk about this a little bit earlier in the term. There's not always going to be a test that is appropriately normed for use with an individual from a specific cultural background. Does that mean it's better not to test? Well, it might in some situations. In other situations, you might need to avail yourself to the best possible option. And then in interpreting test results, you want to be aware of all the factors related to. We also want to take into account that there is a history with testing that isn't completely pure. There's history of misdiagnoses, of using assessment inappropriately, and to actually deny rights to certain individuals. So there are some things around assessment that are sensitive, and it's important to be aware of that. We talked about carefully considering the validity, reliability, etc., and the appropriateness of testing with particular clients. And we refrain from making and reporting diagnoses if we believe it's going to cause more harm than help. We don't want to look at tests as a way to shut people out of services or resources. Kind of reiterating here, but there are all kinds of characteristics that can affect assessment results: age, color, race, national origin, culture, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, religion. all of these kind of social characteristics can affect the viability of test results. So really what I want us to think about is that test fairness and test bias are complicated ideas, psychometrically and sociopolitically. I think it's important for us as professionals to know the difference between fairness and bias, and hopefully we've covered that a little bit. Wow.
Dad,
Uh-huh.
we just about to come down.
No, I'm recording something for my class.
I tried to do one of the things that went around this egg, except this egg was too big, so I got this.
Oh,
This egg
nice.
stand.
Yeah. That is killer, dude. I love it.
Yeah, we just had to use the hair dryer.
I heard that. Hey, I gotta finish this lecture for my students.
Oh, and we were also doing vegetable oil experiments. It got kind of messy.
Yeah.
And it would be better if we were more prepared when we had a tub of freezing water and then